Eli was 11 years old, and the fields at the edge of his small rural town were his entire world. They were a sea of whispering grass and gnarled oaks, a place where the only sounds were the wind and the distant cry of a hawk. It was on one of these aimless explorations, pushing further than he ever had before, that he found the barn. It stood alone in a hollow, a structure so consumed by time and neglect it seemed to be sinking back into the earth. Its wood was warped and silvered by decades of sun and rain, and thick coils of ivy and thorny bramble choked its base, pulling at the walls. The roof sagged like a tired spine, and the few remaining shingles were black with rot. Most unnerving were the windows, not just boarded over, but seemingly sealed shut with layers of crude planking and rusted metal straps, as if someone had been desperate to keep something in, or everything else out. A deep quiet hung over the place, a silence that felt heavy and watchful. Eli stood frozen at the tree line, a primal instinct telling him to turn back. But curiosity, that stubborn engine of childhood, held him fast. He took a hesitant step closer, then another, the dry grass crunching under his worn boots. That's when he heard it, a sound so faint it was almost part of the wind, a low, melodic humming. It was a tune he almost recognized, a fractured piece of a hymn, or perhaps a lullaby, but rendered alien and unsettling by its source. It came from within the sealed barn, a sound that had no right to exist in that tomb-like silence. The melody was soft, yet it carried a profound sorrow that chilled him to his core. It was the sound of loneliness given voice. A cold dread, entirely new to him, coiled in his stomach, warring with a desperate, terrified need to understand. He stood there for a long moment, a small boy in a vast field, listening to the impossible whisper from the decaying wood, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He finally turned and ran, not stopping until the whispering fields and the terrible, humming silence were far behind him. The image of the decaying barn and its eerie, melodic hum clung to Eli for the rest of the day, a cold stone in his gut that even his mother's stew couldn't warm. That evening he found his grandmother in her usual chair by the hearth, her knitting needles clicking a soft, steady rhythm against the crackle of the fire. The familiar, homely sound was a stark contrast to the fractured hymn from the hollow. He waited for a lull, gathering his courage. "Grandma," he began, his voice quieter than he intended. She looked up, her eyes clouded with age, but still sharp, fixing on him. "What is it, Eli?" "You've been quiet as a mouse all evening. I was out by the old fields today." "The ones past the creek." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I found a barn." "An old one, all boarded up." The rhythmic clicking of her needles stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, filled only by the pop of a log in the fireplace. Her hands, veined and spotted with age, settled slowly in her lap. Her expression, usually soft with affection for him, had tightened into something wary and ancient. "That place," she said, her voice a low murmur. "You shouldn't go near there, child. Some things are best left buried." "But I heard something," Eli persisted, the memory making his skin prickle. "A sound. Like humming." A shadow passed over her face, deep and fearful. She looked not at him, but into the flames, as if seeing another time. "The barn women?" she whispered, the words tasting foul. "That's what my own grandmother called them." "A story from so long ago, it's more ghost than truth." Eli leaned forward, his fear now mixed with a potent, morbid fascination. "Who were they?" "A family," she said, her gaze still lost in the fire. "The Millers." "They lived out there, kept to themselves. Then one day they just vanished from town. The father, he was a stern man, God-fearing, they said, but his fear curdled into something else, something hard." She shook her head slowly. He believed the world outside his land was sin itself. Full of corruption, his zealotry became his family's cage. What happened to them? Eli asked, his voice barely a breath. No one knows for certain. The story says he sealed them inside, cut them off from everything and everyone to preserve their purity. She spat the word like it was ash. He built walls to keep the world out, but he built a tomb to keep them in. Generations, Eli, lost to the dark inside that wood. She finally turned to look at him, and her eyes were full of a deep old fear. Promise me you'll stay away. That humming, it's not a welcome. It's a warning, a lament for something that can never be found again. Eli sat perfectly still, the warmth of the fire doing nothing to dispel the chill his grandmother's words had sent through him. The idea of a family sealed away for generations was too enormous, too terrible to fully grasp. But they must have needed things, he whispered, his mind struggling with the practical horror. Food, medicine. His grandmother's hands twisted in her lap, the yarn tangling slightly. There are stories, she said, her voice even lower now, forcing him to lean in to hear. Stories no decent person tells in the light of day. Of provisions left at the edge of the property in the dead of night, by those who took pity. Of things being taken inside after the moon had set. But no one ever saw who took them. It was a silent transaction, with a sealed box. She fell silent again, the weight of the untold pressing down on the cozy room. The familiar shadows cast by the firelight now seemed to twist into unfamiliar, menacing shapes. "And the children?" Eli finally asked, the question that had been burning in him since he first heard the humming. "Were there children?" A profound sorrow deepened the lines on her face. She nodded slowly, a gesture of immense weariness. "The children are the heart of the fear, Eli. The reason the story has never died. Over the years, a few folks, trappers, kids on a dare, they've claimed to have seen things through the cracks in the old wood before those cracks were sealed up too." She took a shaky breath. They spoke of little faces, pale as mushrooms pressed against the gaps, of eyes that seemed too large for their heads, staring out at a world they could never touch. Sometimes the stories said their shapes were wrong. Not monstrous, not like in a picture book, but off. A limb bent at a strange angle. A gaze that didn't quite focus. As if the dark and the closeness had shaped them differently. She looked at him, her eyes pleading. "They are spoken of in hushed, superstitious tones, Eli. Not as people, but as omens, as proof of the patriarch's sin, but to me," her voice broke slightly, "to me it has always sounded like a tragedy. A whole line of souls born into a world no wider than those rotting walls, their only crime being the fear of a man long turned to dust." She reached out and gripped his hand, her skin papery and cool. "You must understand. It is not a ghost story, it is a grave. Promise me you will let the dead rest." The warnings coiled in Eli's mind like smoke, but they could not smother the burning curiosity. For days, the image of the sealed barn and the fragmented, sorrowful humming haunted his every quiet moment. He had to know. He had to see. He enlisted his friend Sam, a boy whose natural caution was the perfect counterweight to Eli's grim fascination. Sam's reluctance was palpable as they trudged back toward the hollow 2 afternoons later, his steps hesitant where Eli's were driven. "This is a bad idea," Sam muttered for the 10th time, eyeing the distant silhouette of the barn against the grey sky. "My pa says that place is cursed, says it's why the crops won't grow right near it." "We're not going inside," Eli said, his own heart thudding a nervous rhythm that belied his confident tone. "We're just going to look. There's a board on the side, all splintered. We can maybe see in." The barn seemed even more forbidding on this return, the silence around it heavier, the air colder. The warped boards looked like ribs on a carcass. They approached with the slow, careful steps of hunters stalking dangerous prey, their breath misting in the chilly air. Eli led them to the side where a long vertical crack had been imperfectly patched with a newer, splintering plank. "You first," Sam whispered, hanging back a few feet, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. Eli nodded, his mouth dry. He pressed his eye to the narrow gap between the splintered wood and the older board. The darkness inside was absolute, a thick, velvety blackness that seemed to swallow the faint afternoon light. He could smell it, a complex odor of damp earth, ancient hay, and something else, something sweetly organic and faintly unpleasant, like old milk. He waited, his eyes straining, seeing nothing but shifting shadows his mind created. He was about to pull back, defeated, when a pale shape drifted into the sliver of his vision. It was a face. It was there for only a second, a ghost in the dark. It was inhumanly pale, the skin like parchment. But it was the eyes that froze the blood in his veins, enormous dark pools that seemed to absorb the scant light, reflecting a deep, uncomprehending sorrow. They were not the eyes of a monster, but of something lost and terribly afraid, human, yet not. A sharp, scraping sound erupted from the darkness just behind the face, a dry, grating noise like stone on stone, or something heavy being dragged across a rough wood floor. Eli jerked back from the crack as if burned, a gasp catching in his throat. He didn't need to say a word. The raw terror on his face was message enough for Sam. The two boys turned and fled, their flight panicked and blind, crashing through the undergrowth without a backward glance, the echo of that scraping sound chasing them all the way back to the edge of the known world. The face in the dark and the sound of something scraping in the shadows did not leave Eli. They followed him into his dreams, a silent, pale watcher in a sea of blackness. The warnings of his grandmother and the superstitious fear of the town now felt like a feeble echo of the real, tangible dread that lived inside that barn. He needed something solid, something that wasn't just whispered lore or a fleeting, terrifying glimpse. He needed proof that they had existed, that they were real. The next day, under a sky the color of dull slate, he walked into the town's historical society. It was a small, dusty room attached to the back of the library, smelling of old paper and lemon polish. An elderly archivist, Mrs. Gable, looked up from a large, leather-bound book, her spectacles perched on the end of her nose. "Can I help you, young man?" she asked, her voice soft but wary. Eli's courage almost failed him. I was wondering if you had any old records about families that used to live around here." Mrs. Gable studied him for a long moment, her eyes seeming to see right through to the fear and curiosity warring inside him. "Any family in particular?" "The Millers," Eli said, the name feeling dangerous on his tongue. A subtle tension tightened the skin around her eyes. She closed her book slowly. "The Millers," she repeated, as if tasting the word. "That's an old name. Not one folks around here talk about much." "I know," Eli said. "But I want to know if they were real." Mrs. Gable sighed, a sound of profound weariness. She looked toward the door, as if ensuring they were alone, then back at Eli. There was a deep reluctance in her posture, a lifetime of understanding the town's collective desire to forget. "Some histories are best left on the shelf, child. They don't do anyone any good to dig up." "Please," Eli insisted, his voice earnest. "I just need to see." After another long pause, she nodded, almost imperceptibly. She rose and moved to a tall filing cabinet in the corner, its drawers labelled by decade. Her movements were slow, deliberate. She pulled a single, yellowed sheet of paper from a folder marked 1890 to 1899. She carried it back to her desk as if it were fragile, laying it down gently under the lamplight. "The 1890 census," she said quietly. "The last official record." Eli leaned over the desk. The paper was handwritten in faded brown ink, the script formal and precise. He scanned the list of names until he found it. Miller, Josiah. Miller, Constance. Miller, Agnes. Miller, Mary. And below them, 2 more names, too smudged by time to read clearly. His heart hammered. They were real. His eyes dropped to the bottom of the entry. There, in the same formal hand, but with a slightly hastier flourish, was a note. It was separated from the family data by a single, stark line. "Seclusion by choice," it read. "No further contact." The words were cold, bureaucratic, final. They carried the weight of official dismissal. But to Eli, standing in the quiet, dusty room, they rang with a hollow, terrible irony. He could almost hear the archivist from a century ago, a stranger to the hollow, writing the note based on some second-hand account from a nervous townsfolk, completely unaware of the truth festering inside those sealed walls. It wasn't a choice, it was a sentence. The note wasn't a record of fact. It was the first layer of the lie that had buried the Millers alive. The irony of the census note, seclusion by choice, echoed in Eli's mind for days, a cold official lie that made the reality of the barn feel even more grotesque. The sky seemed to share his unease. By the third afternoon the air grew thick and heavy, the light taking on a sickly greenish-yellow cast. The wind, once a gentle whisper through the fields, began to keen, pulling at loose shingles and whipping dust into frantic spirals. The storm broke with a sudden violent fury. It wasn't like the gentle summer rains Eli knew. This was something primal and purposeful. The first thunderclap was not a rumble, but a concussive blast that shook the windows of his house. Rain followed, not in drops, but in a solid, drenching sheet that hammered the roof and turned the yard into a churning mud pit. Lightning fractured the bruised sky, each flash illuminating the world in stark, terrifying relief. Eli watched from his window, his breath fogging the glass. Each lightning strike felt like it was getting closer, the thunder arriving almost instantly after the blinding light. The storm seemed centered over the outskirts of town, over the hollow. Then it happened. A searing, blue-white fork of lightning connected the heavens to the earth with a sound like the world tearing in half. It struck the massive, ancient oak that stood sentinel beside the derelict barn. The light was blinding, leaving purple after-images dancing in Eli's vision. The accompanying thunder was a physical blow. Through the torrential rain, he saw the great tree shudder. A deep, groaning crack split the air, louder even than the storm's roar. For a moment, the oak seemed to hang in suspension, its core illuminated by the lethal energy that had just coursed through it. Then, with a slow, inevitable grace, it began to fall. It did not crash away from the barn. Its immense weight and the direction of the gale-force wind drove it directly into the barn's side. The sound of the impact was a sickening crunch of splintering wood and tearing metal. The old, dried-out timbers of the barn wall, already strained by decades of neglect, offered little resistance. When the dust and debris settled slightly, visible even through the slashing rain, Eli saw it. A jagged, dark breach had been torn into the side of the sealed structure. It was a violent, gaping wound in decades of enforced isolation. The oak tree lay like a fallen giant, its trunk and branches having smashed through the planking and the rusted metal straps, creating an opening into the absolute blackness within. The storm raged on, but now it felt different. It felt like a violation had been completed. The world had finally and brutally broken in. Eli pressed his face against the cold window pane, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The storm's fury was beginning to wane, the lightning now flickering farther away, the thunder arriving as a low, grudging growl. But the rain continued its relentless assault, sheeting down the glass and obscuring the world in a shifting grey veil. His eyes remained fixed on the distant hollow, on the dark, jagged tear the fallen oak had rent in the barn's side. It was a wound in the fabric of everything he'd been told, a violent answer to a century of silence. The blackness within the breach seemed absolute, a void deeper than the night around it. Then a shadow detached itself from that deeper darkness. It was a faint, wavering movement at first, barely discernible through the torrential rain, then another and another, figures emerging from the breach with a painful, unnatural slowness. They moved with a stiff, ungainly hesitation, their forms blurred and distorted by the downpour. Their movements were not those of people stepping into freedom, but of creatures unaccustomed to open space, their limbs operating with a rusty, mechanical awkwardness. They stumbled into the rain-soaked night, their pale shapes ghostly against the dark earth. One figure paused, its head tilting back as if feeling the rain on its skin for the first time, a gesture that might have been wonder or agony. Their progress was a lurching, uncoordinated shuffle, as if their bodies had forgotten how to walk without the press of walls on every side. They did not run or spread out. They huddled together, a small cluster of shadows weathering the storm's violence, their forms suggesting a profound physical deterioration from a lifetime, generations of confinement. Eli watched, frozen, a cold dread seeping into his bones. This was not the triumphant escape of prisoners. It was a tragic, stumbling exodus into a world they had been taught to fear, rendered even more terrifying by the storm that had freed them. The rain mercifully obscured the details, leaving only the haunting impression of their unnatural movement and their overwhelming vulnerability. They were out. The sealed world had been breached, and its inhabitants, pitiable and lost, were now adrift in the raging night. The storm passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and dripping. But the clean air and the dawn light did little to calm the town. A new tension had taken root, born of Eli's secret knowledge and the jagged hole in the barn wall. It was a quiet, waiting dread. It broke just after sunup. Mrs. Henderson, who lived in the last house before the fields gave way to the wild hollow, arrived at the general store just as it opened, but she was not there for flour or sugar. Her face was ashen, her hands trembling so violently she could barely hold the shawl clutched around her shoulders. Her eyes were wide, pupils dilated with a fear so fresh it seemed to vibrate off her. She didn't wait to be asked. The words tumbled out in a frantic, breathless rush to the storekeeper, Mr. Higgins, and the few other early patrons who froze at the sight of her. "Last night, after the rain stopped," she stammered, her voice thin and reedy, "I was in the kitchen putting a glass of water to my lips, and I saw her. Out in my backyard, just standing there, staring right into my window." Mr. Higgins leaned forward, his usual gruffness replaced by a wary intensity. "Who, Mabel? Who did you see?" "A woman," she whispered, the word laced with horror. "But not right." So thin, like a skeleton wrapped in pale cloth. And her face. She shuddered, a full-body convulsion of revulsion and terror. It was wrong, twisted, not like an animal, but like something that grew in the dark without a mirror. Her eyes were so big. Just black holes. She described how the figure had simply stood there in the damp gloom of her yard, motionless, her gaze fixed on the warm-lit square of the kitchen window, a silent, ghastly spectator to a mundane life she could never have. The violation of it, the intimacy of being watched in her own safe space by something so utterly alien, was what seemed to unhinge her the most. I dropped the glass. It shattered on the floor, and when I looked back up, she was gone, just vanished. No sound, no footsteps in the mud, nothing. Her account, blurred by the adrenaline of fear, left room for doubt. Was the face truly disfigured, or was it simply gaunt, malnourished and shocking in its foreignness? Had she truly seen a twisted visage, or had her own terror painted the blank canvas of that pale face with a monster's mask? It didn't matter. The details were less important than the raw, emotional impact. Her vulnerability, the profound violation of her home's sanctity, was a spark thrown onto the dry tinder of the town's long-held superstitions. The story spread from the general store with the speed of the preceding storm. By midday, the quiet dread had crystallized into a sharp, shared panic. Doors were locked that were never locked before. Children were called in from playing in their own yards. The barn women were no longer a ghost story. They were out, they were watching. And the town felt for the first time that the walls of its own world had become terribly thin. The panic that had simmered since Mrs. Henderson's sighting boiled over by late afternoon. Fear, once a private whisper, became a public cry for action. Men gathered outside the general store, their faces set in hard, determined lines that did little to mask the unease in their eyes. They were farmers and tradesmen, men accustomed to solving problems with their hands, and this was a problem that had crawled out of the dark and into their light. They armed themselves not for a hunt, but for an extermination. Lanterns were lit, their flames dancing nervously in the breezeless air. Rifles and shotguns were taken down from mantles, their cold, familiar weight a comfort against the unknown. There was talk of creatures and things, the words spat out with a venom that dehumanized the shadows they sought. It was a mob mentality, born from a deep, primal need to purge the unfamiliar from their borders. Eli watched from the edge of the group, his stomach churning. He saw not brave protectors, but frightened men transforming their fear into anger. He wanted to shout, to tell them about the census record, about the sorrow in those enormous eyes, to explain that they were chasing tragedy, not monsters. But the words died in his throat, choked by the grim, collective certainty of the armed men. The party moved out toward the hollow, a grim procession of light and steel. Eli followed at a distance, his own conflict a silent storm within him. The fear his grandmother had instilled was real, a cold knot in his chest. But it was now tangled with a new, aching empathy. He had heard the humming, he had seen the face. They were victims of a cruel history, not demons from one. The men fanned out around the barn, their lanterns casting long, leaping shadows that made the familiar landscape seem alien and threatening. They shouted to one another, their voices too loud, trying to assert dominance over the oppressive silence of the place. They peered into the jagged breach left by the lightning strike, but none dared enter the absolute blackness within. It was Sam's father who found the first sign near the tree line, away from the barn itself. He called out, and the men converged, their lanterns pooling light on the soft, rain-dampened earth. There, pressed into the mud, was a set of footprints. They were small, disturbingly so, like those of a child. But the gait was wrong, the steps too close together, the impressions deep and clumsy, as if the walker was unsteady, unfamiliar with the ground beneath them. A few feet away, half hidden in a tuft of wet grass, lay another artifact. One of the men bent and picked it up with the tip of his knife, holding it up for the others to see. It was a doll, ragged and filthy, its yarn hair matted with dirt, its dress a faded scrap of cloth. It was handmade, crudely stitched, a pathetic little effigy of a child's love. It was not a thing of horror. It was a thing of profound, heartbreaking innocence. The men stared at the doll and the small, strange footprints. The angry chatter died away, replaced by a confused, uneasy silence. The evidence before them spoke not of monsters, but of lost, frightened children. The mob's certainty faltered. Eli looked from the hardened, bewildered faces of the men to the small prints in the mud, and his internal conflict crystallized into a cold, clear resolve. His fear was still there, but it was now overshadowed by a powerful, protective empathy. They weren't hunting creatures, they were hunting people. And he could no longer just watch. The search party returned to town as the sun dipped below the horizon, their lanterns glowing like sullen eyes in the twilight. The men were quieter now, the aggressive energy of the mob dissipated by the unsettling innocence of the doll and the small, clumsy footprints. They spoke in low, confused murmurs, the words freaks and things replaced by, "What in God's name?" and never seen the like. The fear was still there, but it had curdled into a bewildered dread. Eli walked behind them, the image of the ragged doll burning in his mind. It wasn't a token of menace, it was a relic of a childhood spent in shadows, a pathetic attempt to create comfort in a world of rot and isolation. The men saw a mystery. Eli saw a profound injustice. That night, lying in his bed, he couldn't escape it. The whispers of the town felt like a physical weight, the fear, the superstition, the readiness to condemn what they didn't understand. He thought of the face in the crack, not as a monster's visage, but as a prisoner's, pale, sorrowful, and terrified. He thought of the census note. Seclusion, by choice. The lie of it made him feel complicit. Everyone in this town, by their silence, by their willingness to let the story fester into a legend, had helped keep those walls sealed. Guilt was a cold stone in his gut. His curiosity had started this. His flight from the barn had been one more act of rejection. And now, with the wall breached, the town's answer was to gather with guns and lanterns to hunt down what they had helped create. But they weren't monsters. They were victims. Women and children born into a cage built by one man's madness and maintained by a town's collective neglect. The empathy that had been growing in him since he first heard the humming now solidified into a fierce, protective conviction. Someone had to see them as they were. Someone had to bear witness to the truth, not the legend. The decision crystallized in the dark. He would go back. Not with a mob, not with a weapon, but alone. He would enter the barn and see for himself. It was a dangerous, perhaps foolish plan. The barn was a place of decay and unknown horrors. The townsfolk, if they found out, would see him as a traitor, consorting with the very things they feared. But the alternative, allowing fear and hatred to dictate what happened next, was a greater horror. As the moon rose, casting silver streaks across his floor, Eli made his choice. He would not let the story end with torches and guns. He would go into the dark, not as a hunter, but as the first person in generations to look upon the barn women not with fear, but with the desperate hope of understanding. The decision sat in Eli's gut like a lead weight, cold and immovable. He waited until the deepest part of the night, when the moon was high and the town was sunk in a silence broken only by the chirping of crickets. Slipping from his window was easier than he'd imagined. The house, like the town, was asleep, dreaming its safe, ordinary dreams. The walk to the hollow was a journey through a ghost world. Moonlight silvered the fields, making the familiar path strange and ethereal. The barn loomed ahead, a darker blotch against the night, the jagged breach left by the fallen oak a black maw in its side. The air grew colder as he approached, carrying that same complex scent he'd caught before. Damp earth, the sweet rot of decayed hay, and something else, something intimately organic and stale. He paused at the edge of the breach, his heart hammering against his ribs. The darkness within was absolute, a solid thing. It seemed to push back against the moonlight, refusing its entry. Taking a shuddering breath, Eli dropped to his hands and knees and began to crawl forward. The transition was immediate and oppressive. One moment he was in the cool night air, the next he was engulfed in a stifling sensory void. The air was thick and heavy, laden with a century of dust that coated his tongue and filled his nostrils with the taste of dry rot and forgotten time. The smell of old hay was overwhelming, layered over with the pungent, unmistakable odor of long-term human habitation. Unwashed bodies, waste, and a profound, weary sadness that seemed baked into the very wood. He rose slowly to his feet, his eyes straining against the absolute blackness. As they adjusted, shapes began to emerge from the gloom, defined by the faint slivers of moonlight piercing other cracks in the walls. He was in a large, single room. The space was a chaotic jumble of survival and despair. Makeshift partitions of ragged blankets and splintered boards created pathetic attempts at privacy. He saw piles of mildewed straw that served as beds, their hollowed shapes telling of countless nights of restless sleep. There were crude shelves holding chipped bowls and wooden cups, and a large, stained rain barrel stood in one corner, its purpose grimly obvious. But it was the walls that held his gaze, that made the breath catch in his throat. Every available surface, every plank not hidden behind a hanging blanket, was covered in drawings. They were rendered in what looked like charcoal or faded berry juice, the work of unskilled, childish hands. They depicted stick-figure people under a large radiating sun, crude animals, simple flowers. They were scenes of a world they could only imagine from stories passed down, a world of light and openness that stood in stark, heartbreaking contrast to the damp, enclosed darkness they inhabited. The drawings were not frightening, they were a testament to a stifled, desperate longing for a life they had never known. This was not a monster's den, it was a nursery tomb. The weight of the drawings pressed on Eli, a silent scream of longing from the dark. He moved deeper into the barn, his feet shuffling through layers of dust and brittle straw. The air felt thick, each breath a conscious effort against the centuries of stagnation. In a far corner, partially hidden behind a moth-eaten curtain, he found a small, makeshift alcove. It was neater than the rest, a space set apart. On a crude shelf, fashioned from a split plank, stacked with a kind of desperate orderliness, were the journals. There were dozens of them, bound in cracked leather or rough, homespun cloth, their spines softened by generations of handling. Their sheer number was a monument to the passage of time in this sealed hell. With trembling, dust-coated fingers, Eli lifted the one on top. It was the oldest, its pages brittle and brown at the edges, the ink faded to a ghostly sepia. He opened it. The script was formal, elegant, but the words were a dirge. The early entries spoke of devotion, of a father's fierce love, and his righteous mission to protect his family from a sinful world. But within pages the tone began to curdle. The writer, Josiah, he presumed, railed against the corrupting influence of the town, his zealotry twisting into paranoia. The entries became shorter, sharper, filled with edicts and prayers. The world outside was no longer just sinful, it was an active poison, and the barn was the only pure vessel. Eli set it aside, his throat tight. He picked up another, then another. The handwriting changed over the decades, becoming less practiced, more erratic. The language simplified, the vocabulary shrinking as the writer's world shrank. They documented births with a grim tally, deaths with a stark finality. The slow descent was charted in heartbreaking increments, mentions of fading eyesight from the perpetual gloom, of limbs aching from lack of space, of minds growing quiet and inward. He found a journal whose cover was stitched with a faded blue thread. The writing inside was a clumsy, earnest scrawl. It spoke of games played in the dust, of stories told by a grandmother who still remembered the taste of an apple. Then the entries grew sparse, filled with long silences. On one page, near the end, was a single sentence, the letters large and painstakingly formed, as if written by someone struggling to see. The light from the crack is gone today. Did the world end? The most recent journal was bound in a piece of faded floral print cloth. The entries were fragmented, often just a date and a single word: cold, hungry, afraid. But toward the middle he found a longer passage. The handwriting was shaky, but clearer than the others, the words chosen with a terrible, aching clarity. October 12th, it began. I am Mary, my mother told me. Her mother told her of the world. She said the sky is a blue bowl and the grass is a green sea. She said there is a thing called music that is not just humming in the dark. I try to remember her words. I say them every night so I do not forget like the others. They call me strange for it. They say the only world is the wood and the dark, but I remember. I am the last one who remembers. Sometimes I think I hear the world outside, a bird, the wind. It sounds like freedom, but Father Josiah says freedom is a sin. He says the outside light will burn us. I am so tired. I want to see the blue bowl just once before I forget too. Eli's vision blurred. He sank to his knees in the dust, the journal clutched in his hand. It wasn't a record of madness. It was a record of a memory being systematically erased, of a light being deliberately snuffed out over generations. Mary's words were not the ramblings of a monster. They were the last, desperate testament of a human soul clinging to a truth that was being buried alive around her. The horror of the place was not in what was created here, but in what had been so meticulously destroyed. Eli's tears fell silently onto the dusty floor, each one a tribute to the profound loss detailed in Mary's journal. He was so absorbed in her sorrow, in the weight of generations of stolen lives, that he didn't hear the soft rustle at first. It was a whisper of movement like dry leaves shifting in a corner. He froze, the journal still clutched in his hand. Slowly he raised his head. They stood at the edge of the weak moonlight, filtering through a high crack. 3 figures. They were even paler than he had imagined, their skin possessing the bluish-white translucence of mushrooms grown in absolute dark. Their proportions were subtly unsettling, limbs a little too long and thin, heads seeming slightly too large for their slender necks, giving them a fragile, almost ethereal appearance. They were swathed in layers of ragged, faded cloth that hung loosely on their gaunt frames. But it was their faces that held him. They were not twisted or monstrous. They were human, etched with a deep, weary anxiety, and their eyes, like the one he'd seen at the crack, were enormous and dark, wide with a fear so ingrained it seemed a fundamental part of their being. They did not advance. They simply stood, watching him, their bodies tense with a readiness to flee. One of them, a woman who might have been young but seemed ageless in her pallor, took a half-step forward. Her movement was hesitant, unsteady, as if her muscles fought against the simple act. She raised a thin, trembling hand, not in threat, but in a gesture of pleading supplication. Her voice, when it came, was a thin, raspy whisper, the words broken and archaic, as if learned from a book a century out of date. "Please," she breathed, the sound barely stirring the dusty air. "The light, the harsh light, you must not let it in." The others behind her nodded fervently, their large eyes fixed on him with a desperate intensity. Their fear was not of him, Eli realized with a jolt. It was of what he represented. He was from the outside. He was the bringer of the very thing their world had been built to avoid. It burns," another woman whispered, her voice cracking with a terror that was clearly born of experience, not superstition. "The world, it burns." They saw him not as a savior or even an intruder, but as a breach, a walking, breathing embodiment of the destructive outside light their patriarch had sworn would scourge them. Their plea was not for help to escape, but for him to leave, to seal the wound he had entered through, to restore the only safety they had ever known, the familiar, suffocating dark. Their tragedy was complete. They were begging to be re-entombed. The women did not retreat, but their collective tension was a palpable force in the thick air. The one who had spoken first, her eyes holding a depth of sorrow that seemed to hold the weight of all the journals Eli had just read, took another hesitant step. She was older than the others, her face a delicate web of fine lines, her back slightly stooped, but her gaze was clear and sharp with a terrible, weary knowledge. "I am Agnes," she said, her voice a dry rustle, yet carrying a strange, formal cadence, as if she had learned her speech from another time. "You are from out there." The words were not an accusation, but a statement of profound, weary fact. Eli could only nod, his own voice trapped in his throat by pity and awe. Agnes's eyes drifted past him, seeing not the rotting barn, but the ghost of its history. "He was a man of fierce belief," she began, and there was no love in her tone, only a bone-deep resignation. "My many times grandfather, Josiah Miller, he believed the world was a garden of sin, and that to walk in it was to be corrupted. His fear was a cage, and his love was the lock." She gestured vaguely around the dark, close space. "He built this place to be our ark, our sanctuary from the fall. He sealed the doors himself, nailed the windows shut. He said it was to keep the sin out, to preserve our purity." A bitter, hollow sound escaped her lips, something that might have been a laugh in another life. "He preserved nothing but our fear." She spoke of the early days, not from memory, but from the stories passed down, the same stories that filled the early journals. The desperate attempts at normalcy, the lessons from books that grew fewer as the books themselves crumbled to dust, the births. "The children came," she whispered, and her voice broke for the first time. "And with them, the changes. The dark and the closeness. It shapes the clay differently. Limbs that did not grow strong. Eyes that learned to see in the murk, but could not bear the sun. Minds that knew only these four walls." She looked at her own hands, pale and slender. "We are not monsters. We are his monument. A monument to a fear so great it warped the flesh and spirit of his own blood for generations." She told of the slow dwindling of their numbers, of sickness that could not be doctored, of stillborn babies and the silent, aching grief that became their normal. She spoke of the world outside fading from a memory to a legend, and then to a forgotten myth for all but a few, like Mary, who clung to the stories until even they slipped away. "We lived in the dark," Agnes said, her final words, falling into the dust like stones. "We learned its sounds, its smells. The light from the cracks was a terror, a reminder of the burning world he promised awaited us. Our bodies bent to the space, our minds bent to the solitude. We are what remains when love is poisoned by fear and left to ferment in the dark for 100 years. We are his sin, not ours." Her tale was not one of horror, but of profound, devastating tragedy. The root evil was not the women themselves with their warped bodies and isolated minds, but the zealotry of a man long dead, a legacy of control and fear that had condemned his descendants to a living death. Agnes's tone was not one of anger, but of a weary, final resignation. She was the last keeper of this terrible history, and in sharing it, she seemed to shrink, as if the burden of it was finally too heavy to bear alone. She had offered Eli not a secret, but a confession for a crime she did not commit, and in doing so had made him a bearer of its weight. The weight of Agnes's confession, the sheer scale of the tragedy, sat like a stone in Eli's chest. He was still trying to form a response, words of comfort or understanding that felt pathetically inadequate, when a new sound cut through the barn's oppressive silence. It started as a low murmur, distant but growing rapidly in volume and intensity. Shouted voices, hard and angry, carried on the night air. The flickering, bobbing light of multiple lanterns began to dance through the cracks in the barn walls, slicing through the darkness like accusing fingers. The barn women recoiled as one, a collective flinch of pure, instinctual terror. They shrank back from the light and the noise, their large eyes wide with a panic Eli recognized from trapped animals. Their breath came in short, ragged gasps. Agnes's resigned weariness vanished, replaced by the primal fear of a lifetime of hiding. "They come," one of the younger women whimpered, her voice a terrified whisper. The harsh light comes. The mob had converged on the barn. Their fear, once a confused dread after finding the doll, had been reforged into something uglier and more certain during their walk back to town. The unknown was now a known quantity, and their response was not curiosity, but eradication. "Come on out," a man's voice roared from outside, raw with a fury that was mostly fear. Eli recognized it as Mr. Higgins from the store. "We know you're in there, freaks. Show yourselves." Other voices joined in, a chorus of hostility that beat against the old wood. "Monsters! This ends tonight. Godless things." The words were meant to dehumanize, to strip the figures inside of any pity or compassion. They were no longer lost souls or tragic victims. They were freaks, monsters, aberrations born of sin that needed to be purged. The lantern light intensified, focusing on the breach where Eli had entered, illuminating the swirling dust motes like a spotlight on a stage. Agnes pushed the other women back, deeper into the protective shadows of the barn, her own body trembling, but her stance protective. She looked at Eli, and in her eyes he saw the culmination of her story, not just the fear of Josiah's legacy, but the fear of the outside world he had promised would destroy them. The mob outside was proving him right. The pounding started then, not on the sealed doors, but on the walls themselves, heavy fists and the butts of rifles beating against the warped wood. The whole structure seemed to shudder with each impact. The demand was clear, brutal, and final. They were not asking for surrender. They were demanding a confrontation, their fear having fully curdled into a violent, prejudiced anger. The judgment of the town had arrived at the barn door, and it was spelled out in firelight and fury. Eli's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the roar of the mob and the pounding on the walls. He saw the raw terror in the women's eyes, a fear so deep it was a physical part of them. They cowered from the slivers of lantern light as if from a scourge, their bodies trembling. These weren't monsters, they were victims about to be punished for the crime of their own existence. He couldn't just stand there, he had to make them see. Pushing past his own fear, Eli scrambled toward the jagged breach in the wall. He had to get between the mob and the women to be a voice of reason in the storm of hysteria. He squeezed through the opening, emerging into the chaotic glare of a dozen swinging lanterns. The sight that met him was terrifying. The men from the search party were there, their faces twisted into masks of fear and rage, illuminated in the jerking light. Behind them, more townsfolk had gathered, drawn by the noise, their expressions a mixture of morbid curiosity and grim approval. They formed a half-circle around the barn, a wall of hostility.
"Stop!" Eli cried out, his voice sounding thin and reedy against their shouts. He spread his arms as if he could physically block their advance. "Please, just listen." The pounding ceased momentarily. All eyes turned to him, shocked by his sudden appearance from the one place they were all afraid to go. Mr. Higgins stepped forward, his face flushed. "Eli? Boy, get away from there. Have you lost your mind?" "They're not what you think," Eli pleaded, desperation giving his words force. "They're people. They've been trapped in there for generations. Their ancestor, Josiah, he sealed them in. He was the monster, not them. They've never known anything but darkness. They're scared. They're sick. They need help, not this." He gestured wildly at the armed men, the torches. He tried to make them see the tragedy. He spoke of the journals, of the childish drawings on the walls, of Mary's fading memory of the sky.
He described Agnes's weary resignation, their broken speech, their terror of the harsh light. He laid out the entire heartbreaking history of control, fear, and isolation. For a moment, a flicker of uncertainty passed through the crowd. Some of the men exchanged uneasy glances, remembering the small footprints, the ragged doll. But the moment was fragile. A man at the back, someone Eli didn't recognize, shouted, "He's been in there! Their filth has poisoned his mind!" The spell was broken. The collective fear, simpler and more powerful than empathy, reasserted itself. Mr. Higgins's face hardened again. "They're abominations, boy, born of sin and seclusion. Look what they've become. You can't reason with a thing that's never known God's light." "They're just women!" Eli shouted, his voice cracking with frustration and despair. "They didn't choose this." "Step aside, Eli," another man growled, hefting his rifle. "This ain't a time for a child's foolishness. This is a cleansing." Their refusal was absolute. They had already decided what lived in the barn. Facts, history, pleas for mercy, none of it could penetrate the wall of their prejudice. They saw only monsters, a blight to be burned away to restore their own sense of safety and normalcy. Eli's defense, born of courage and a desperate empathy, was utterly futile against the tide of collective hysteria. He stood before the breach, a lone, small figure, against a mob whose judgment was final and whose fear had extinguished all hope of reason. The air crackled with impending violence. The mob's refusal was a solid wall, their faces set in lines of fear and righteous fury. Eli's words had evaporated in the heated air, meaningless against their certainty. The tension snapped. A younger man, his face flushed with panic and a desperate need to act, lunged forward. In his hand was a lit lantern, its flame dancing wildly. It was not a calculated act of malice, but one of blind, impulsive terror. He didn't aim for the women or for Eli. He simply hurled the lantern in a high, frantic arc toward the dark, gaping maw of the breach. It was an act of pure, unthinking panic, a final solution to a problem too frightening to comprehend. The glass shattered against the splintered wood inside the barn. A gush of burning oil splattered across the dry, rotten planking and the ancient, bone-dry hay that littered the floor. For a heart-stopping second, there was only the sound of shattering glass. Then, with a soft, terrifying whoosh, the fire caught. Flames erupted, climbing the tinder-dry walls with a hungry, eager speed. The light was no longer the gentle glow of lanterns. It was a violent, roaring inferno that threw the entire scene into a hellish, flickering relief. A collective gasp, part horror and part grim satisfaction, rose from the mob. They fell back a step from the sudden, intense heat. Inside, Eli heard a chorus of high, keening whimpers, the sound of pure, animal terror. He spun around, the heat blistering against his back. Through the raging flames he saw them. The barn women were not trying to flee the fire. They were retreating, scrambling away from the roaring light and heat, dragging each other deeper into the barn's dark heart. Their movements were not toward freedom, but away from it. They were choosing the only safety they had ever known, the familiar, suffocating darkness at the back of their prison. The world outside, which had just proven its cruelty with fire, was a greater terror than the flames themselves. They vanished into the thick, black smoke coiling from the rear of the barn, choosing a known, sealed fate over the unknown cruelty of the world that had condemned them. The fire took hold with a terrifying roar, consuming generations of journals, drawings, and makeshift homes. The heat was a physical force, driving Eli back out through the breach. He stumbled into the night air, choking on smoke and despair, the sounds of the women's resigned whimpers and the crackle of devouring flames branding themselves onto his soul forever. The barn, and everyone inside it, was being consumed. The town's fear had finally completed the work Josiah Miller had begun a century before. The barn became a pyre, a roaring column of flame and black smoke that painted the night sky in shades of orange and hellish red. The heat forced the mob back, their angry shouts now silenced, replaced by the crackling roar of the fire and the groaning protest of ancient timbers giving way. The light was unforgiving, exposing not monsters, but the stunned, soot-streaked faces of men witnessing the horrifying consequence of their panic. Eli stood apart, his body trembling not from the heat, but from a cold, sickening horror that had taken root deep in his bones. The sounds from inside had ceased, swallowed by the Inferno's voice, but he could still hear them, the high, terrified whimpers, the final resigned retreat into the dark. They had chosen the fire over the mob. The thought was a wound that would never close. He didn't wait to see the structure collapse in on itself. He turned and walked away, unnoticed by the mesmerized crowd. The night air, once cool and clean, was thick with the acrid stench of burning wood, old hay, and something else, something sweet and terrible that he knew was the smell of a history being erased. By morning, nothing remained but a smouldering, blackened scar on the earth and the skeletal remains of the great oak. The town, in the harsh light of day, began its work of forgetting. The official story, repeated in hushed tones at the general store and over kitchen tables, was one of tragic accident. A lantern had been dropped during the tense confrontation, a terrible, regrettable mistake. No one spoke of the thrown lantern, of the panic, of the collective decision to burn rather than understand. The truth was buried under a blanket of shared, shameful denial. But Eli carried the truth with him. It was a physical weight. He had managed to salvage a few of the journals, the ones he had clutched as he fled the flames. Their covers were smudged with soot, their pages warm to the touch. They were not just books, they were ghosts. And the sounds, the humming, the scraping, the final resigned whimpers, they never left him. They echoed in the quiet moments, a permanent soundtrack to his life, a haunting memory of the women who had chosen the fire and the town that had gladly supplied it. Years later, Eli returned to the field where the barn had stood. He was a man now, the softness of youth hardened into the lean angles of adulthood, but the hollow in his chest had never filled. The land had tried to heal itself. Lush grass and wildflowers now carpeted the blackened earth, and young saplings reached for the sun where the great oak had fallen. Only a few charred, half-buried fragments of timber hinted at the structure that had once dominated the hollow. He carried a small, oilcloth-wrapped bundle, the journals he had salvaged from the fire. Their pages were brittle, their words faded, but their weight was immense. He knelt in the soft grass, the silence of the place a stark contrast to the roaring memory in his mind. He unwrapped the bundle and laid the journals gently on the ground, arranging them in a rough circle like stones for a hearth that would never hold fire again. It was a poor memorial for generations of stolen lives. There was no headstone, no epitaph that could capture the depth of the tragedy, but it was a testament, a refusal to let the town's convenient lie be the final word. He had borne witness, and this was his act of remembrance. He stood, his eyes sweeping over the peaceful, sun-dappled field. The air was sweet with the scent of clover and warm earth. It was over. The secret was ash, the silence complete. He turned to leave, to carry the rest of the weight with him alone. And that's when he heard it, faint, almost indistinguishable from the sigh of the wind through the grass. A low, melodic hum. It was the same fractured hymn, the same sorrowful lullaby that had first chilled him as a boy. It lasted only a second, a single, clear note hanging in the air before it was gone. Eli froze, his breath catching. It was memory, he told himself. A trick of the wind, a phantom woven from grief and guilt. There was nothing left here to hum. But as he stood there, the hair on his arms prickling, the sound felt neither like memory nor wind. It felt like an echo, not fading but enduring, a legacy not of ash but of sound, sewn into the very air of the place, waiting for a listener who would remember. He did not look back. He simply bowed his head, accepting the haunting, and walked on, the faint, familiar echo lingering in the space between the world and what lay beneath it.